So what I'm going to be talking about today is a very broad discussion, really with the intent of getting some thoughts going, in the audience here, some things for you all to think about around demand-side management or energy efficiency. I'm going to run fairly quickly, hopefully, through some basics, and then I'm going to talk about some challenges, which to me equal opportunities, and the challenge and opportunities of them is going to be fairly mixed in the discussion that I have here. Before starting that, though, I just want to mention that we have two quiz questions at the very beginning here. And I just want to make it very clear. The first question is only for those born after 1977. The second question is open to everybody. So I just want, as we get to that, I don't want any shouting out by the pre-77s here, okay? So, basics. So here's our first quiz question. Who wore this sweater on February 2nd, 1977?
Mr. Rogers?
He probably wore it. That's close, right? Jimmy Carter. All right, here you go. You got to catch him. Remember, caring is sharing, all right? All right. So Jimmy Carter, about 2 weeks after becoming president, we were in the midst of another energy crisis. And he came out and he spoke in front of the fireplace wearing that sweater and talked about that we need to have an energy plan and we need to conserve energy. We need to learn to waste less energy, keep our thermostats at 65 in the daytime, 55 at night, turn off the lights. And I would say generally, I was only like a year old at the time, but I think generally what people heard from this was it's time to freeze in the dark. And in many ways, this is, the beginning of the modern energy efficiency industry. So the second quiz question now is, let me get my pointer out. This is open to everybody. Let's see if I get the right button here. There's a button. Let's see, I'll probably blind myself before I find it. Well, there is a button here. There it is. Okay, who is this gentleman right here? He was charged with writing that energy plan. Very good. Who was that? I don't know. Do you have liability insurance for here? I don't know. You're going to have to pass them around, all right? Very good. Yeah, you're a good friend. There we go. All our good friends.
What's different about his hair in the two pictures? He changed his perk.
Oh. That was a very stressful time. I had to realize this. So I mentioned that President Carter mentioned conservation mostly, and I want to start this off and quickly go through this as sort of a difference between efficiency and conservation. I think that's a really important topic, particularly as we get later in the presentation. Hopefully the things I talk about in the basics connect in with the things I talk about, some of the challenges and opportunities. And, to me, conservation is doing less with less. It's, turning off the lights. Whereas efficiency is using less energy to provide the same service, the same benefit. So, here's the pointer. So with this one example of a street light, conservation is turning off the street lights. Efficiency is putting in energy efficient lamps into the street lights and using controls to make sure that they're only on when they're needed and maybe varying the light intensity during that time. It's a big difference. It's a very important thing when we talk about regulation and policy. So this really got started in the 70s, and in some ways it really got started in California when essentially there was a discussion that started up around mid-late 70s about whether we just keep building power plants or is there something else to be done. And there was a lot of thinkers, Amory Lovins being one of them in the soft energy paths, but folks from the Environmental Defense Fund here in California said, no, we don't need to just assume that electricity in particular will grow at 5% a year, and therefore we just need to build a string, and literally that was one of the plans, to build a string of nuclear power plants up and down the coast of California. There's maybe another way, and it has to do with perhaps using less energy. So in that context, we're facing some key energy challenges. And, one way to organize them is we're dealing with cost issues of energy, reliability issues, and the environmental impacts of energy. So what does efficiency do for you? Well, first of all, it's relatively cheap. So dealing with that cost side. We could do an entire month, year, lifetime about this chart here that compares the costs from a utility point of view of what it takes for different resources. These blue ones are from EIA. This green one here on end-use efficiency is from a brand new report from Lawrence Berkeley Lab. And basically the concept here, without getting individual numbers, is if you look at what the cost is, and I don't know why this says inches, but it's supposed to be cents per kilowatt hour, is the cost of energy efficiency against all these different resources. So is it this much or a little higher or a little more or whatever? Is this one particularly higher or lower? The concept here is that efficiency is a low-cost resource. Next, in terms of reliability, many of us who live in the U.S. are very used to turning on that light switch and the lights come on. Other parts of the world aren't as fortunate. And as we look at alternatives for how we're going to supply, particularly electricity, in this country and other places, there's a lot of concern about the reliability. And the advantages of efficiency is that, it can be targeted, it's modular, it's relatively quickly implemented, say, comparing to building power plants. And it has, capacity and reliability benefits. It also, particularly, this is a big issue in California, is it helps with the integration along with demand response of integrating renewables. But really, a bottom line for efficiency is wouldn't it be better if we need to supply energy that instead of having to build 500 coal power plants, nuclear power plants, natural gas plants, wind turbines, wouldn't it be better to build 250? So the way I try to put this in my simple way of thinking this is, if your boat sank and you had to get to shore, or if we had to build a lot of power plants for the future, wouldn't it be better to only have to swim half a mile than the whole mile to shore? Or shouldn't we just have, maybe if we just built less of those power plants, and efficiency helps with that by reducing the demand. And then there's the environmental impact. Again, could spend a lot of time with this. Some of you are probably quite familiar with this graphic. A lot of debate about its validity and such, but conceptually I really like it for being one slide to show what efficiency does. And what we have here is the cost of various greenhouse gas mitigation strategies from a study that McKinsey did a number of years ago for Vattenfall, Norwegian utility. And what I've highlighted here is all these energy efficiency, demand-side management things. And above the line is a net cost, below the line is a net savings. And so essentially what you have is that efficiency, much of efficiency can be done, is actually at a negative cost. Turning to what the market is like is more of the sort of background on the efficiency industry. There's lots of ways in which we can do efficiency actions to engage in the marketplace. Probably hard to read, but there's a lot of them here listed. Mostly in the U.S., excuse me, the way we've affected that is by doing building codes, requiring buildings to be more efficient when they're built or renovated, appliance and other equipment efficiency standards, codes and standards we tend to call that. A major area has been programs paid for by utility customers. Those are the one many people are used to, rebate programs, for example. And then sort of overlapping with this is there's an energy service ESCO industry that's been developed really starting in the 70s. So what have these efforts done over the years? Well, codes and standards, there was a study done recently looking at what the savings are. And, starting from essentially zero in the 70s or 80s, in 2012, they were estimated codes to save about 1% of our electricity demand, and standards, equipment standards, saving another 1% for a total of about 2%. Utility efficiency programs, they've been around for quite a while, but it looks like from a recent LBL study that they're up to about 0.5% of annual decreases in electricity consumption as a result of those, with projections of them moving up into the order of 1% or so, even with just current policies and such. Just as a comparison, EIA estimates our electricity growth is about 0.6% a year. So these are representing some significant changes that we've done with efficiency. What's the size of the market? What's the size of this industry? It's really hard to say. There's been quite a bit of studies. One that I like, partly because I'm affiliated with LBL, is one that was done in 2009 showing about $18 billion of related revenue with about 380,000 people employed. This is just in the service sector. And maybe if you look at the manufacturing, the products, you can get up to 2 to 3 times that scale. So that gives you some idea of how big this industry is. It is bigger than the Greek yogurt industry, but much smaller than, say, the oil industry. And these industries are growing. I won't go through a lot of detail on these next couple slides here, but this graphic is just showing these projections for various scenarios of what the growth will be. This one in the utility customer-funded programs. I think the only thing to really take from this is it's showing growth in that industry. This is the ESCO industry. Again, lots of stuff on this chart, but the main point here from this, again, this LBL study is showing potential for some significant growth. And it's happening everywhere, well, almost everywhere. These are the states that have energy efficiency resource standards, basically requirements for efficiency to be part of the resource planning in those states. Actually, and I know of several others that weren't shown on this ACEEE study that have happened. Although over here in Indiana, a couple days ago, the Indiana legislature voted to end their commitment to energy efficiency. And that's sitting on the governor's desk, whether that'll be signed or not. So one step backwards there, a lot of steps forward in other places. This is the utility programs around the country. And again, some of these states that are white, including Mississippi, is really starting to ramp up their efforts, as is Oklahoma. And Nebraska has 182 munis, which is why they're having a little trouble organizing their utility efforts. These are building codes. Again, just give you a sense that efforts to work on building codes are pretty much throughout the country. Different color coding showing sort of the intensity of the codes in place. So in summary, it's good stuff. It's happening all over the place. It reduces waste, it saves money, improves reliability of the infrastructure, energy infrastructure, environmental benefits. Also everybody can participate. Unlike other types of energy resources, everybody can, in their own home, their apartment, their business, their factory, their laboratory can, do things to reduce energy consumption, reduce waste. It generates in local development and jobs. A lot of the jobs that are generated from efficiency actually aren't directly related to the workers themselves, but they're indirect, benefits that come from, if I'm spending less money on my utility bill, I can spend it on my local community to buy, more candy bars or whatever. Severin Bornstein talked a little bit about this in his talk on Rebound a couple months ago with potential impacts that has on actually increasing energy consumption as well. So it's good stuff. It's already done a lot. It's cheap. Lots of opportunities. Bottom line, it's the greatest thing ever. So what's the problem? In some ways, I guess that could be the end of the presentation. But besides a frying planet, it sounds pretty good. There's all this stuff. All the graphs are going up. So what's the problem? Well, what I think the problem is kind of shown in this graphic, which is from a potential study that was done by Navigant Consulting for the California Public Utilities Commission. And let me explain a little bit about what this shows. And let me start with this perhaps hard to see little diagram down here. The way most what we call efficiency potential studies are done is that you start by looking at what is the technical potential of any energy efficiency actions you can think of. And then you look at, well, of those, which ones are cost effective, which ones are economically reasonable. And then of those, you look at, well, what are the ones that people might actually do? Just because things are cost effective doesn't mean that people do them. There's some, achievable or market potential, depending on how you want to call it. So that's what this graphic is showing. Up here is the technical potential. A little lower below that is the economic potential. And these are various assumptions about what the achievable or market potential. So roundabout, this number up here for 2025, I think is the year this goes out to. Let's call it, 15,000 megawatts equivalent. Economic potential around 12,000. Okay, but it drops to about half with this market potential. So basically, the problem is we're not hitting our potential. There's a lot more out there. There's something between this economic potential or maybe even this technical potential and the achievable potential. That's what I think the problem is. And so there's these barriers to energy efficiency. And this is one of my favorite graphics from a fellow named Tom Ekman that I put lots of titles on. This one, we'll just call it How Many People Does It Take to Screw in an LED? In other places, I put engineers or economists. It depends on what the audience is. So the way a lot of people in the efficiency industry look at those barriers is what I consider to be sort of a version of the tragedy of the commons. Yeah, it's all these great stuff. It's great for society, the environment. It probably saves lots of money for everybody. But it's not necessarily the choice of individuals. And it's individuals who are mostly making decisions unless there's some mandate. So because of that, there's a sense of a need for intervention in some manner or not, some manner. So there's these almost classic definition of what consumer barriers are. It takes money up front. I'm a renter. My landlord, I'm a renter. I pay the bill. But I don't want to spend money to fix up my landlord's building. My landlord doesn't have any incentive to fix up his building because I'm paying the bill. There's definitely lacks of information, understanding. I want to do something. What do I do? Where do I go? There's just transaction costs, just uncertainty in the documented benefits. So these are sort of classic consumer barriers. And this is actually going to be the last time I talk about these because I want to talk about different challenges, where I call what's really the problem. So I was thinking about how to put this presentation together, and I went back to work I did earlier in that 30 years or so or whatever. And I used to do project development, building independent power projects. And I learned in doing that as you do any kind of development, you look to the various risks, and you want to mitigate those risks as you're investing your money or other people's money. And a classic way of looking at those risks are a market risk. What you're doing, no one's going to want to buy it anymore. A technical risk, there's a performance problem. We'll talk about that. I have a couple slides on this. Economic risks, I thought I knew what the economics were for this investment, but that's not really what the economics are. Certainly it takes upfront money. Regulatory risk, particularly in the energy industry, which is a highly regulated industry, the regulations change, and that impacts me. But also there's issues, again, around evaluation, measurement, and verification, and a concern a lot of regulators have around rate impacts. And then there's the political risk. And I'll talk about that at the end of the presentation. And you'll see that I talk about that with a capital P, which I consider to be good politics, and a small p, which unfortunately is not always good politics. So first, market risk. To me, the market risk is that efficiency is this invisible resource. I have three different stories that I tell about that. And I'm looking at the clock. I'll see if maybe I'll do two or three of them. The first one is when I put the PV system on my house, the contractor came out and said, hey, you can put it on this side of the roof or over here. The advantage of putting it over here is that nobody will be able to see it from the street. And I go, oh, I thought that was the whole point of putting a PV system was so everybody could see it from the street. I had an appraisal for refinancing my house, and the appraiser came out and he saw the PV system, made notes, and was interested in it, and actually showed up in the appraisal report. But when I asked him, hey, would you like to see my energy efficient heating system or know how much insulation I have in the walls, he looked at me as like, do you want to look at my toaster or something? It was irrelevant. I'll stop it there. I think you get the point. Efficiency, it's hidden in the attic over here. It's not visible. So what can we do that? I mean, as we move forward and try to increase that market potential part of the graph that I showed you, part of it is to drive demand. I mentioned Greek yogurt before. I mean, certainly several years ago, I never heard of Greek yogurt, and it seems like I have it for breakfast every other morning. Somehow, and it's a good thing. I like it. It's a good thing. But somehow there had to be some way to drive demand for that. And if the frozen yogurt was hidden up in my attic, in between the rafters, I probably wouldn't have gone for it. So somehow we need to do this. So ways in which, and this starts getting some of the opportunities here, and perhaps some of the challenges around driving demand, is one is just better program delivery. What I mean is that we get better at offering these services and products in the marketplace. There's certainly room for improvement there, although frankly, in my experience, we've been doing this for 20 plus years. There are no great, wow, if only we had told people what a great idea this was or something. I haven't really seen huge innovation in the program delivery. I am seeing innovation in some of these other areas, though. One is data. I know a lot of you here work with data. It's obviously a part of Citrus, a part of this campus. A part of the other campuses, Washington too, is the availability of data and what we can do with that. So getting this information out and using the data, again, it can be a talk in itself. Benchmarking. I think one of the best uses of the additional data is benchmarking. That is providing comparisons. One of the drivers for people's behavior, I'm on soft ground here because I'm an engineer, not a sociologist, is letting people know what a social norm is and knowing, how am I comparing with my energy use against others. It's also useful from a pure business point of view. If I've got 50 retail stores, I benchmark the stores. I can pinpoint why is that store using, twice as much dollars for energy use per square foot than my other buildings. There was a famous study, moving to the next thing about disclosures, making this information public, is on a campus in a dormitory where there was individual metering of the dorm rooms, and there was a competition as to who would use the less energy. And they had, the control group, and then they had a second group that the information about how their consumption was doing in comparison to the other rooms was sent to the individuals. And then there was a third group where it was posted up on the bulletin board in the dorm. So I think we can all kind of guess pretty quickly as to which group had the best energy savings. And that's where we get to disclosure. Disclosure and labeling. Labeling is an example here. I believe this is, I wrote it down where I grabbed this one from Slovakia. So all of us, I'm sure, speak Slovakian here. But just sort of an idea that just a really simple thing is, here's where your building is. Really simple. If you're to have that label, just like we sometimes do with our appliances, that information, in my sense, is that if this was on buildings, it would inform people for their purchases for homes. But if they're in commercial buildings, I might not really care if I go into a department store that's rated A, B, or C. But over time, I bet you're not going to have too many department stores that are labeled E, F, or G down here. So that's disclosure and labeling as means to drive demand. And then there's the old classic, which is raise rates. I suspect that many of us are familiar with that approach and also are familiar with why that isn't the first thing I mention to regulators or to consumer groups when I suggest how to drive demand. But it's out there, and I don't think we should forget about it. The last area is in mandates. These are the codes and standards. To me, given climate goals, I think we're going to end up here. My sense is that just like the smoke detectors that are hopefully somewhere in this room, or the wheel trail ramp that allows our disabled citizens to get into this room, we're going to decide that it's a community social good that essentially just needs to happen. And the costs will hopefully be there. But we need to get there. We need to show people the levels at which we can do voluntary action. And it's starting to happen. These are states and cities that have adopted various disclosure or benchmarking rules, including our own Berkeley and San Francisco here. And if you're interested in this area, I encourage you to explore what's happening with these. I think it's very encouraging for driving demand. So technical risk, second area I mentioned. So one of these technical risks is that energy efficiency savings are estimates. I spend a lot of time in my work in this area of trying to document the impacts associated with energy efficiency and renewables. And renewables is relatively easy. You can stick a meter on the output of your PV system or your wind turbine, your solar tower or such. But efficiency, they're estimates. And this causes a lot of concern. Essentially what happens with efficiency is here we have a building. This is energy use in a building, the black line. Energy loss goes along here, goes up and down. You have your intervention, your installation of efficiency measures. Hopefully it's generally lower. but the only way you can determine what those savings are is by making an assumption, a counterfactual scenario about what would have happened without the efficiency project to come up with these energy savings. So essentially, you're always going to need to estimate this. There's a lot of ways to do that. It's a whole other talk. But a technical risk with efficiency is that the savings are estimated. And that was just sort of the project level. Then there's all these other things that can impact what the savings really are. Concern about people who would have done the action anyways, what us in our industry call free riders. There's spillover. It's the ability of programs to affect those who weren't participating. Persistence of the savings. Mentioned Severin talked about this a couple months ago here, the rebound effect, and just the market price and the effects, these other things that can drive changes in energy consumption. Not knowing that, not having something where you can take that tape measure or that meter and going out and measuring energy savings has been a barrier to energy efficiency. We need to do better at that. These big issues really come down to, for this evaluation, measurement, and verification, is how good is good enough? How good does that estimate have to be, just than any other estimates that we work with? And really sort of as compared to what? There's different risks that you can have in terms of overestimating or underestimating. And sometimes in terms of underestimating the savings, you might go to an energy resource that has its own risk. Other technical risks I think many people would first start with is, is there more efficiency to come? Is it a renewable resource? This is my one and only slide on this. My answer is I'm not too worried. One, because there's people like you all here on this campus developing these things. Starting with the developing world, see we have the Berkeley cook stove, LED lamps replacing kerosene lamps. About a quarter of the world's population get their lighting from fossil fuel. And so there's a lot of room we can have for improved making efficiency as well as the environmental benefits. But, we have a SEER 21 air conditioner now available on the market, probably about double what, conventional air conditioning in most people's homes are. LED lamps. These are, brand new variable speed drives, but able to put on very small motors. And then we have the whole area of improved data collection. There's some, I don't know what this is, some thermostat, I think. Some company just paid, like $12 to buy the company or something. They saw some opportunity in, a renewable resource associated with, controlling energy. And just the use of the data. This is a very hard to read map of Cambridge, where using the kind of data, to map out what the energy consumption is, per building, per block. And just sort of really ties in with not only technology, but the ability for us to use technology and working more with communities. Economic risk. So the classic concerns are energy prices go down. Well, that's a concern to people in the energy efficiency industry, not really to anywhere else. Most people consider that to be a good thing. But if what I'm doing is trying to displace energy, then I have some concern if energy prices go down. It's generally been quite a while since I was worried about long-term energy prices going down. But we obviously do have a significant reduction in natural gas prices. This is a graphic showing up till today, showing gas prices going down. And these are projections from EIA for where natural gas prices can go in the future. And it's quite variable. So this is a concern. And I don't think we're going to be affecting the world energy markets, but this is one of those classic risks that we need to deal with. This one's supposed to say cost of efficiency goes up, like say, we have more and more efficiency as new technologies that become more expensive as we move off the cost curve. One balance for that, though, is that efficiency is actually a first cost activity. So in some ways you have better control over that than, say, over natural gas prices. It actually is a hedge against the volatility in natural gas prices or energy prices because you know what you're going to pay for. It's a first cost. That cost might go over time as you do incremental measures, but unlike natural gas prices, if I invest in a gas turbine, I have to make assumptions about natural gas prices. If I invest in efficiency, once I made that decision, my fixed cost is fixed. And then there's always a concern around disruptive technologies. What I thought was the way things work aren't the way things work anymore. And to me, from Google to utility death spiral to other talks, I like to think of efficiency as that disruptive technology. But coming back to what I consider to be the big economic risk, and it ties in with the regulatory and the politics, is that it takes money. I get fairly frustrated with people who only talk about the payback associated with energy efficiency and ignore the fact that it takes front-end cost. So this is just one example from another McKinsey study looking at the U.S., showing, in different markets, residential, commercial, what a total, benefits are, but what a total cost of taking $1.2 billion to do that. And that's going to require money from somewhere. So that's another real challenge in the economic side, is where are we going to get the money to make these investments, even if they are cost-effective over the long term. So that runs into the regulatory risk. So I had that great graphics up there, except for Indiana, showing all the wonderful things happening around the country. It looks really good when you present it that way. Maybe not quite as good when presented this way. These are all our states. And this is showing their savings as a percent of retail sales for 2010 by state. So even though all those states might have been colored in, even though North Dakota over here probably had a nice color showing it was doing something, the reality is it's not doing much. And why is that? Well, it's the realities of the regulatory structure under which these utility programs work. First of all, it's very important to recognize that energy really is a highly regulated industry. And energy regulation is a conservative thing. And actually, for most of our lives and most of the things we do, we're actually fairly happy that it's conservative. So that when I walked in here today to give this presentation and they plugged in the computer, it worked. The power came on. We really like that. And you probably don't want regulators and utilities going, oh, I have a new idea. Let's see if we can do this tomorrow morning. Conservativeness is an asset within energy infrastructures. But it doesn't mean it's not necessarily a hotbed of innovation. Another area is an aversion to rate impacts. This is probably the biggest challenge I see around the country because, as I mentioned in the last slide, this is going to take money to do this. And if it takes money up front, that means in the short term, rates can go up. Now, your energy bills can go down, but your energy bills go down for your participants. They don't necessarily go down for everybody. So what this leads to tends to be budget limits. And then the last thing, which I think Indiana provides us a this week example, what I call the regulators giveth, the regulators can taketh away. And so needing, for all this, a culture, ethos of efficiency and commitment, consistency. This is something, wearing my industry advocacy hat. It's the first thing I mentioned in the regulatory environment is we need consistency. We know what's going to happen. If I'm a company investing in Indiana, I need to know that's going to be there for a while. And now that's gone into question. A lot of questions, a lot of discussion about what the role is of the utilities in all this. But I think one fundamental part of this, no matter what happens to the utility business model, is that that structure needs to not hinder the customer saving energy, not wasting energy. And some of the structures and way in which utilities are compensated, they tend to get compensated more by selling more energy. And that efficiency is really treated as a resource, an actual resource. And that's another issue we see in a lot of the regulatory environments. I want to do a quick call out to greenhouse gas regulation. Again, another full talk. This is really the great hope of efficiency. It's actually been the great hope of efficiency for about those 30 years or so, that we'll be able to monetize the environmental benefits of them instead of just being an unmonetized externality associated with this. I think it's pretty close for those who think about it, that in order to meet our greenhouse gas goals, we're going to need to decarbonize the electricity sector, in part because decarbonizing other sectors is going to be significantly harder. But efficiency is pretty tricky, particularly for electricity, because it's an indirect emissions reduction strategy. Again, a much longer talk here, but there is a lot of hope for efficiency in greenhouse gas regulation. We have in California a cap and trade program. There's a similar setup in New England states called the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, RGGI, and there's opportunities, as is being done in the Northeast, not here yet in California. I don't know if there's anyone here from the governor's office. Their current plan is to spend the auction funds on things like high-speed trains, but in the Northeast at least, there is a Probably about 80-90% of that money goes to parallel efficiency programs. And we have EPA has come out with a regulation for existing power plants. It's actually 111B. And this coming summer, there'll be a regulation coming out from EPA for regulating greenhouse gas emissions from from existing power plants. So the new power plant rule is 111B. That's out for comment. The 111D will be out this coming summer. It's pretty much given, I'd say at this point, that efficiency will be one of the mitigation strategies. I'm having the opportunity to work on that, so I can't talk too much about it. But we also only got 5 more minutes. So I'm going to move on to policy risk. So to me, a way to think about what we want to do with policy is that we have this continuum of actions that kind of needs to keep growing, keep going. It needs to be continually fed. It's fed with RD&D. It moves on to deployment. And hopefully we lead to transformed markets where something either becomes standard practice, like CFLs, going from, you've got to be kidding, I'm not putting that thing in my socket, to becoming a very common source of lighting, to just being mandated, as we see with, say, national standards and California standards for lighting. And then we need to cycle that back. We got the CFLs coming back with LEDs or other technologies. So this would be a nice sort of way to think about policy, but what's really happening with that? Well, in terms of progress on the policy front, I would say one of the best things that's happened in my time is that we no longer debate about whether wasting energy is a good thing or a bad thing. Pretty much agreed. Democrats, Republicans, conservatives, progressives, wasting energy is a bad thing. I don't have really any debates with folks about that anymore. The challenges, though, are really come down from a policy point of view, though, is what's the role of government and what's the role of market? Should government take a strong role in this, or should the market decide? And if the government decides, is that a local, state, national, or international, effort that needs to be done, or some combination of that? And of course, as I mentioned early on, politics with a capital P, I actually think that there are very good things about politics, the idea of people working together to find solutions. And in all this, there are a lot of people doing politics with a capital P. We do have some politics with a small p, however. On the good front, the Congress, I think it was the end of last week, with 191 Republicans, the House of Representatives voted for energy efficiency legislation. It was pretty wimpy energy efficiency legislation, but it was actually more Republicans voted for it than Democrats. So there is some progress there. But, having this sort of different approach that some of our small p politics has about this gave me my opportunity to do one of my favorite graphics of what might be coming forward. So in this, though, and these will be my last points today, is where's the voice of efficiency? So we have these regulatory and policy issues. So, where is the efficiency industry? Where is that voice? And there's kind of a problem. It's invisible. It's kind of hard to measure. And the way I describe it in a policy context is it's the first mentioned and first forgotten. Our president, candidates from president in the last couple elections, all mentioned efficiency and then went on to talk about something else. Part of this issue is, how much is the industry spending on advocacy and lobbying? I worked with an intern. We put together a summary. Unfortunately, the numbers we back is 2008. They probably increased a little bit. But the entire reported lobbying of the entire efficiency industry was about $500,000. Now, I was going to do a graphic that showed how much the oil industry, the utility industry, the nuclear industry, the Greek yogurt industry spends on lobbying. But I thought I wouldn't take the time because I think you already know it's a heck of a lot more than $500,000 across the whole country in every state. In terms of political action committees, groups that are specifically formed to advocate for this and support politicians that support their positions, there's one. It's in California. It was started a year ago. There are really no national political action committees for efficiency. So generally speaking, efficiency industry is loved but not feared is the way I kind of think about it. It has an identity issue. It's very diverse. It's diffuse. It's the good news, bad news about the efficiency industry. Probably every legislative district in California, every legislative district in the country has people working on energy efficiency, people who can go talk to their legislators about the jobs and the opportunities and how they see this. But they're very diverse. They might not even identify themselves with that. And if they do, they sometimes have a lack of focus. There's conflicted interests between the different groups within the efficiency industry. There's essentially a lack of unified advocacy. To sort of show some of that diffuseness, these are some graphics, showing where different businesses are. These are the companies that do energy rating of homes. These are insulation manufacturers. This is just to give you an idea of the scale of these. This is from a study from Massachusetts. About half of these companies are under 10 people. It's diffuse. It's all over the place. It's a strength, but also a weakness in terms of organizing because of this diversity. This is one graphic. I won't ask you to look at all this, and hopefully I won't explain anything more than just the general concept of this slide. This is, again, from an LBL report that just shows, just in the commercial efficiency service sector, these are all the different types of people, businesses are involved in this business. And they all don't have the same perspective, the same interest, and the same unified vision for doing efficiency advocacy. So there is a group in California. I'm the board chair emeritus, so a bit of a prejudice, I suppose, am I putting up here. But these are things happening with our sort of slogan here of moving efficiency forward, of trying to get that advocacy in support of the policy actions. So in conclusion, it's more than just about the light bulbs. It's about the market, it's about the economics, it's about the regulation, and it's about the politics. So go get them. There's lots of opportunities for you to work in the technologies. There's lots of opportunities for you to work in all these other areas as well. And so, the way I look at it is, find the community that you want to participate in and go get them. So with that, thank you very much.
Thanks very much for that quick overview. It strikes me that one of the areas where the measurement and demonstration issue is less complex is in commercial buildings. So I wonder if you have some graphics showing the speed of uptake, the potential impact of focusing on commercial buildings as a target for energy efficiency interventions, and then, if in fact that's been a more effective route, does that help you in sort of selling it generally?
So thank you for the question. I don't have any graphics specifically around commercial buildings. The information would generally be available as to how much uptake there is in the commercial. Different sectors have different potential, and they have different numbers in terms of their cost effectiveness. Generally speaking, the commercial sector has been a major area for efficiency historically, and primarily around lighting retrofits. And lighting retrofits are pretty straightforward in terms of documenting the savings, at least on a site basis. The math is not very complicated. I took out a 40-watt light bulb, I put in a 20-watt light bulb, I saved 20 watts. The question is, how many hours do those lights operate? You get to your savings from a lighting retrofit. Obviously, it can get a little more complicated than that, but that's a basic approach. Something on the order of 70%, I'd say 60, 70%, Carl, you might know, others might know, is lighting retrofits, is the sources in this country today. And those have been pretty well established to the point where there's an area of doing documentation, an approach called deemed savings, where essentially it's an agreed-to stipulation as to what those savings are. And for a number of commercial and lighting applications that have a well-developed history, those values are used. Those tend to be documented in something called a technical reference manual. There's about 20 of those around the country that have been established by states and regions that have lookup tables, essentially, for if you do this specific thing, here is what the deemed savings are that you can use for that activity. And if done right, those can be quite a cost savings. and you can use those for your energy savings estimate. So hopefully it answers at least part of your question.
Hi. I had a question about the economic risks that you mentioned for efficiency, in particular the lower natural gas prices. Last year I was doing some work in Illinois and in Pennsylvania where some of the goal setting ended up being affected by lower natural gas prices because it affected that top-line economic potential, which puts downward pressure on the market potential, right? I guess a question is, you mentioned the valuation of energy efficiency as sort of a way to mitigate the risk of really variable prices. Is that ever actually put into these estimates? Is that risk ever evaluated as a part of cost-effectiveness estimates?
It's a very good question. So the short answer to your specific question is no. However, there's soft ways in which this is taken into account. So what's happening is that in programs that are funded with utility customer funds, your basic utility programs, although they're not always run by utilities, usually decisions are made about what type of actions are going to be allowed based on a cost-effectiveness test, comparing the cost with the benefits, and there's about 5 or 6 of these different tests, different ways to do them, but you get the basic idea. How much does it save and how much does it cost? And that savings is dependent on the fuel cost that you're displacing, your avoided cost of your fuel. As natural gas prices have come down the last several years, it's been very hard to show the cost effectiveness of many natural gas actions. They tend to have relatively long lifetimes, particularly in the residential markets. And so there's been states, and I know actually Illinois has been one of them, but also in Washington State, where the natural gas efficiency portfolios are just simply not cost effective. And some of them are not like 0.98, they're 0.62. They're way off. And so a couple things have happened. On one end of the spectrum, there's been portfolios just stopped. On the other end of the spectrum, as what happened in Washington State, the Utility Commission subjectively took into account these various things that I was talking about. In addition, the concern about stopping and starting programs and the effect that has on the market. So basically, the Washington State Commission looked at these things subjectively and allowed the natural gas portfolios to continue. There's an LBL policy brief on this exact subject that talks about the way I kind of subtitle it is, I'm a commissioner, natural gas prices have dropped, what do I do about my efficiency portfolio? And so it goes through a description of these various things that you could take into account, and some of them can be quantified, some of them are fairly hard to quantify. But a particular one is around the hedge value of efficiency by essentially reducing demand.
So we have a question here.
Hi. So I'm wondering what has been done or what strategies have been attempted to address the diffusivity of service providers and efficiency providers, and if there's been, other than regulation, commercial means that allow these people to attack a diffuse market, a really fractured market.
So were you asking in terms of how they are politically organizing, or how they, as a business, trying to address the changing marketplaces?
I'm interested in the business case.
Politics is so much more fun, though. I guess I don't really have a simple answer I can think of real quick as to how the business industry is addressing this. I think, though, that there is a greater recognition that the same old way of selling efficiency, which I used to do, which was grabbing somebody by the lapels and saying, why aren't you doing this? It's cost effective. Doesn't really get us. We already got those folks. We need to find other ways. And I think a lot of, to me, the hope is companies using tools to provide more information and making that visible. That's one of the strategies I kind of alluded to. There's obviously a number of companies that are working on using this information to provide better information and feedback to their consumers. And I think the Nest thermostat is an example of something where it's a thermostat. I mean, really, but there's something different about it. And that's the kind of innovation that people are looking to sort of get beyond the current penetration, which is relatively low in the marketplace for doing these actions. So I'm sorry I don't have a more direct answer for you, but there's a lot of people in a lot of conference rooms trying to figure out that very question.
Last question.
Maybe you've sort of made arguments really concentrating on, call it absolute cost arguments. Could you also make a case for at least continuing to develop efficiency technologies and perhaps ways of bringing them to market as a hedge against volatility, as making prices more elastic? I think of natural gas prices in Central Europe or something like being able to hedge against those issues.
Yeah. So I think that sort of related a little bit to her question too, is using efficiency as a hedge, and the context there is that I'm an engineer, so everything starts with it depends, but there's different ways. But the basic concept here is that if you reduce the demand, particularly in markets where the pricing tends to be at the last unit sold pricing, you can bring down that price and thus the volatility in that market. So it's really lowering the demand curve there, and that's effect on reducing price. And depending on how the markets, in certain wholesale markets for energy, it can be shown to have a price impact as well. And this is part of what we're looking at, say, during the California's energy crisis, and looking at it's that last units that really drive up the cost of energy. And if you can knock those off, it fights above its weight class in terms of the number of kilowatt hours, its overall effect throughout the energy pricing system. So it's definitely looked at as a hedging. I probably should, maybe both of you, get your cards or something to be able to show you that one policy brief that talks about using efficiency as a hedging strategy. But from LBL, but there's a number of other places that have looked at that as well.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.